All right, so with the first official video of this week, I want to pick up where we left off last week, which was wrapping up our discussion of the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, and thinking about how we can improve conditions in the economy as measured by our three traditional macroeconomic indicators, unemployment, GDP, and inflation, by pulling central levers which we may have access to from a government's standpoint, right? So either by increasing aggregate demand, decreasing aggregate demand, increasing short-run aggregate supply, or decreasing the short-run aggregate supply. So in this video, we're going to start off by looking at that aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, and thinking about which curves we want to move before discussing how we can move those curves from a coordinated central planning type effort. And from there, we're going to move on to discussing the role and the history of government spending in the economy before moving on to our next video where we'll think about taxation and then tying it all together to think about how taxation and government spending can either be classified as fiscal policy designed to impact the economy or just other forms of government and taxation which are not considered fiscal policy but may still impact the economy through an unintended consequence. So I think that this video and the videos to follow are important because they're going to help you be able to predict changes in the economy which are going to be based on government spending or taxation decisions, and should make you more aware of how government spending has changed over the years and how it can change going forward. And there's been a lot of conversation about state and local spending and state and local budgets following the murder of George Floyd in 2020. We can think about the funding of police and the funding of education and coming from the state and local level, and maybe try to clear up some falsehoods on the magnitude of those levels of spending. And then lastly, it is an end goal of this class for you to be aware of how government spending and taxation impact the economy, and hopefully that'll be especially clear after these next couple of videos. So in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, we know that we can increase aggregate demand, we'll call this aggregate demand up, and we can decrease aggregate demand down by either increasing government spending and decreasing taxation, or by decreasing government spending or increasing taxation. And both of those may be valuable at different times based on where our economic equilibrium is, or macroeconomic equilibrium, that we may want to increase taxation or decrease government spending if we're trying to limit price increases, and we may want to increase government spending and decrease taxation if we're trying to decrease the level of unemployment or achieve economic growth. So what we've just generally described is considered fiscal policy, and that is one of the two general ways in which we can impact macroeconomic conditions from a central government perspective. And the other way is going to be through monetary policy. So in this week's videos, we're going to start off by considering fiscal policy because it's a little bit simpler. All we're basically thinking here is that government spend money, and we all know that, right? We all know that government spend and they collect taxes. Then we're going to consider the banking system and monetary policy when we're done considering fiscal policy, because it's a little bit more complex. However, it is just as important when thinking about improving outcomes for citizens of a country and an economy, and is going to be able to make up for some of the shortcomings of fiscal policy. So as is becoming standard in these macroeconomic videos, I think it's helpful to start off here with a definition. So we want to think of fiscal policy as being the use of government spending and tax policy to influence the path of the economy over time. So it needs to be intended to impact the economy. With that in mind, there's a couple key distinctions to make in that definition, that not all government spending is considered fiscal policy. For example, if it's government spending isn't intended to impact the economy, then it's not going to be considered fiscal policy. However, all government spending is going to lead to an increase in spending levels, which is going to increase aggregate expenditure or increase aggregate demand. And so it's going to impact the economy. It just may not be designed to do so. And if it's not designed to do so, that's not fiscal policy. Secondly, not all federal spending is going to be financed by taxes, which is going to lead to budget deficits in a given year and a national debt when all of those deficits are added up. So we looked at this in the Keynesian Cross Lab in the previous weeks, but we're going to focus on the national debt much more in the weeks ahead. But for now, just know that it's possible for the federal government to spend more than it collects in taxes. And so what we're going to do now is briefly consider some historical trends in spending and taxes before considering fiscal policy more generally and the existence of automatic stabilizers, which will be powerful economic tools that we can use to overcome some of the limitations of fiscal policy. So if we were to look at government spending over time in nominal values, we would note that government spending increased from $94 billion in 1960 to over $3,900 billion in 2014. However, that's obviously misleading when thinking about the size of the government and the economy, because that is not accounting for inflation or population. And so when we think about federal spending as a percent of GDP, we'll notice that this has been much more stable over the years. That prior to 1960, we were sure a little bit less than 20% of the size of the economy was government spending, and now we're somewhere between 20 and 25% when we don't take into account the recession associated with the pandemic response. In the next image, we'll take a look at some of these constituent components of the government spending portfolio and see relatively how important they are in a static context at one point in time. But on this this graph, we can see how they've changed over time. We can see that government spending on healthcare has increased dramatically from prior to the 1960s, where it made up virtually 0% of the of GDP, to now it representing more than 5% of GDP just for being spent on healthcare. You see that national defense obviously was higher immediately following World War II and in the Korean War, in Vietnam, and during the Cold War. And even though we're still technically engaged in wars in the Middle East and have been through the past largely 20 years, this is still significantly smaller than it was 40, 60 years ago. So when we look at a more static picture of government spending in the federal budget as being broken down into different components, we can see that really the vast majority of what our federal government, what Washington, D.C. spends, is going to come from national defense, Social Security, healthcare, and the interest which we're paying on the national debt. And that leaves only this small wedge right here, less than 1/3 of what we spend goes to all other types of spending. So what programs fall in that 29% of government spending? basically everything else: international affairs, science and technology, natural resources in the environment and protection of those resources, transportation, housing for those that are economically disadvantaged, education, income support for the poor, community and regional development, law enforcement, the judicial system, administrative costs of running the government. Basically, everything that we think of as impacting our daily interactions with the government, aside from healthcare and national defense, which most of us in this class and on Kalamazoo College's campus don't really think about it too much on a daily basis. But the rest of the stuff is really important and makes up a relatively small portion of our total spending by the government. Okay, now part of the reason why the spending on education is relatively small by the federal government and fits within that 29% wedge of all other spending by the federal government is because that most government spending on education comes from state and local governments. So actually 90% of all education funding is local and state level. And this means that spending on education by state and local governments actually makes up about 1/3 of their total level of spending. So this is both for K-12 and higher education. So what about the rest? What else do state and governments spend their money on? We think of highways, libraries and hospitals, healthcare, parks, and police and fire protection. And so while the federal government, as we said earlier, does not have to pay for their spending with taxation, that in fact, the vast majority of years we spend more than we collect in taxes, most states are required to have balanced budgets. They actually have laws in place that require them to collect as much in tax revenue as they are spending. And so the one state which consistently has no such stipulation is actually Vermont. But for the most part, the states are going to have one form or another of a balanced budget requirement. So that's important because we can see here that total government spending over the past 60 years at the state and local level has actually been increasing as a percent of GDP. So that means that tax revenue collected by the state and local government should be increasing as well. So using these statistics from 2017, in this graph from the Urban Institute, as well as get this from a variety of sources, we can see that this information kind of corroborates the story in our textbook, that between K through 12 education being, let's say, like maybe 22% or something like that, and higher education being maybe around 9%, that about 1/3 of state and local government spending, so as a share of direct general expenditures by state and local governments, goes towards education. That public welfare programs are at the top. They have the plurality, so not the majority of spending, but the largest share for a single component. And that it actually isn't down until between spending on highways and roads and spending on sanitation that we see spending on police. So I think there was a lot of misinformation going around in the summer of 2020, thinking about, well, we're not spending nearly as much on education as we're spending on police, and we should be reallocating, we should be defunding the police and spending more of that on higher education. So I'm not here to tell you what the optimal, what the best amount of money state and local government should spend on police. But what I am here to say is that in general, we actually spend less collectively as a nation of state and local governments on police than we do on all of these other categories. But we spend more on police than we do on prison systems, parks and recreation, fire protection, housing, community development, sewers, and sanitation. So Yeah, that is all I'm going to say on this right now. I wish we could have time for discussion, but I can't really have a discussion with myself here. So that's where we're going to leave off our discussion of state and local spending. So hopefully this has been informative in some way. And we're going to now move on to discussing taxation, which is going to impact all of you at some point in time in your life, if not already.